Number 9. Aerial Bomb. Last year, construction workers found a World War II-era bomb in the foundation pit of a building in St. Petersburg, Russia. With an apartment complex nearby, it was important to remove the explosive as quickly and as carefully as possible. Experienced specialists from the country's Ministry of Emergency Situations reported to the site. They worked through the night, tying ropes around the bomb and delicately lifting it from the hole using a crane. It was then placed on a vehicle and driven to a military training ground where it was destroyed. It's rare to encounter such large-caliber bombs, according to a statement from the ministry. Even though it was removed by a qualified team, working with it came with a colossal risk. It's not entirely uncommon for explosives from past wars to appear decades after the conflict has ended. But sometimes, dangerous devices are deliberately left in places where they put people's safety at risk. This appeared to be the case recently when a giant white missile was found outside a police station in Ayrshire County, Scotland. Several streets were shut down for hours, blocking people from getting into their homes and businesses, while experts assessed the situation. Thankfully, they managed to remove the weapon without incident. Number 8. Pluto's Gate. The Plutonian at Hierapolis, or Pluto's Gate for short, is an ancient temple dedicated to Pluto, the Roman god of death and the ruler of the underworld. Located in modern-day Turkey, the site was rediscovered in 1965. Nobody knows exactly how old Pluto's Gate is, but it's located near the ruins of Hierapolis, which date back to 190 BC, so it's like it was built around at the same time. People used to gather at this so-called Gate to Hell and watch as animals were led into a cave to their deaths. The crowd creatures let out pained screams until they fell to the floor and went silent. This meant that Pluto's breath had killed them. Visitors weren't allowed to get too close to the entrance. Instead, they were encouraged to buy live animals and put them in an enclosed area nearby, so they could see for themselves that Pluto's breath really did kill anyone who went near it. Until relatively recently, experts didn't know how the animals died. While excavating the site, they noticed that birds sometimes fly into the cave and drop dead, courtesy of toxic carbon dioxide gas that seeps up into the cave from underground. Yikes. Only one person fits inside the cave. A staircase leads down to the area where the deadly CO2 emits from within the earth. The cave was sealed after Christianity arrived in the region and condemned the worship of Pluto. Sometime during the 6th century, an earthquake destroyed the temple, and today the site is in ruins. Archaeologists announced in 2017 that they hope to eventually open the property to visitors, albeit with some restrictions on how close they can get to the fatal cave entrance. Which is understandable, all things considered, but do you really think it's a good idea to open something called the Gate of Hell? Number 7. Naked black holes. When a star dies, it collapses in on itself, creating a region of density known as a black hole. In simple terms, the gravitational pull is so great that a black hole consumes anything and everything that comes within a certain distance of it. Once an object crosses a boundary known as an event horizon, it's gone past the point of no return. It'll never escape and will inevitably get sucked into the black hole. At the center of a black hole is a region of density called a singularity. When it comes to singularities, the laws of physics go right out the window. They're strong enough to pull things in faster than the speed of light, meaning that even light can't escape their gravity. An object would need to travel at least the speed of light to have any hope of escaping, and that simply isn't possible. Some scientists believe that the universe contains so-called naked black holes that lack an event horizon. Research published in late 2020 explains that based on the math of general relativity, this is entirely possible. A singularity without an event horizon would be even more dangerous than a standard black hole. With no clearly defined boundary, there would be no buffer zone to keep a black hole's activity separated from everything outside of it, making it much more accessible to everything around it. The concept of naked black holes seems to go against nature, but physicists haven't been able to prove that they don't exist. Even if these terrifying borderless voids truly exist, experts believe they're rare. Extreme conditions would be required for one to form. According to one theory, a typical black hole would have to spin fast enough to create a second event horizon. The two event horizons would then cancel each other out and disappear. Thankfully, no black holes are known to spin quite this fast, even if it's technically possible. And new research shows that naked singularities might be easier to identify than previously thought. If they do exist, they probably behave much differently than other black holes, and may therefore emit much brighter light. The only way to get to the bottom of the mystery is for scientists to advance their knowledge and for technology to become more sophisticated. Number 6. Aralsk 7. The Aral Sea was once the world's fourth largest inland sea, but it began shrinking during the 1960s due to a Soviet irrigation project that diverted the rivers that fed it. By 2010, the sea had all but disappeared. All that's left of it today are a few small lakes. Before the Aral Sea dried up, it was home to a 77 square mile island that straddled the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Known as Vuzrashdenia Island, it is the former site of a top-secret Soviet biological weapons testing site. Known as Aralsk 7, it was built in 1948. There were numerous highly deadly bioweapons tested here, including anthrax, smallpox, plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. Aralsk 7 was undoubtedly dangerous, but you didn't need to go there to be exposed to the deadly diseases that its staff experimented with. In 1971, the facility accidentally released weaponized smallpox into the air. 10 people were infected and 3 died. Around 50,000 nearby residents were inoculated during a mass vaccination that ensued, and the incident was kept largely hidden from the public for years to come. The site closed when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. In the following weeks, around 1,500 residents were evacuated. Today, the site remains littered with the island's abandoned structures, which are filled with containers of hazardous chemicals that were stored improperly and left behind. Some of the containers have sprung leaks, and it's extremely dangerous, potentially fatal even, for anyone to go there. At least 10 anthrax burial sites have been decontaminated as part of an ongoing cleanup effort, but more work needs to be done. Number 5. Lethal gas cloud. To the villagers living along Lake Nyos in Cameroon, August 21, 1986 seemed like any other day. That changed on a moment's notice when a deadly cloud of carbon dioxide started spewing from the lake, turning its typically blue water a deep crimson red. With no time to escape the enroaching gas, at least 1,746 people and 3,500 livestock suffocated to death. The disaster may have been caused by a natural event such as a landslide, a small earthquake, or an underwater volcanic eruption. It alerted locals and experts alike to the previously unknown hazards lurking beneath the lake and the potential for a deadly event to happen again. Scientists investigated Lake Nyos and learned that it's fed by underground springs that are capable of transporting dangerous gases to the lake bed where they accumulate, sometimes for centuries at a time before being released into the atmosphere. While researchers don't know what triggered the deadly outgassing in 1986, it's clear that it could happen again, so they made it a priority to understand the dynamics behind the disaster and hopefully stop history from repeating itself. In the meantime, a degassing system that reduces the water's CO2 content was installed in Lake Nyos to prevent another tragedy. Number 4. Dragon's Hole. Blue holes are underwater caverns or sinkholes that formed during ice ages. In 2016, China announced the discovery of the world's largest blue hole in the South China Sea. Nicknamed the Dragon's Hole, and more formally known as the Yongle Blue Hole, it's located near the Paracel Islands. Locals simply refer to it as the Eye. At a depth of 987 feet, the Yongle Blue Hole vastly supersedes its runner-up, the 663-foot-deep Dean's Blue Hole in the Bahamas. Researchers considered several factors when calculating its depth, including tidal water levels, water temperatures, salt levels, and sea water density. They plan to further explore the Yongle Blue Hole, but have acknowledged that they don't expect to find much past a certain depth because the water contains little to no oxygen and therefore can't support much life. Blue holes are popular diving attractions, but venturing into one can be extremely dangerous even for the most experienced divers. The deeper one goes, the colder the water gets. This can shock the system, and depending on the location, soft materials like sand can cave in suddenly. Deep dives also put people at risk of a condition called nitrogen narcosis, which can severely impair judgment. As a result, a diver with this condition might descend too deep without realizing that they're endangering their life. Number 3. Centralia Mine Fire. Centralia, Pennsylvania is a ghost town. As of 2017, only a handful of people lived there, but it was once a bustling coal mining town with a peak population of 1,500 residents. So, what happened? In 1962, a coal seam fire ignited in Centralia's underground mines. To this day, nobody knows what caused it exactly, but it's believed that illegal dumping may have played a role. Numerous attempts to control or extinguish the blaze failed, and the fire continued to grow. The state got involved and closed the mines for good after detecting lethal carbon monoxide levels. At first, people were unaware of the dangers that the fire posed. In fact, they continued living in Centralia for decades after the disaster started, but the effects became impossible to ignore when gas filled people's basements, their homes began to tilt, and they experienced health problems. Sinkholes appeared and smoke spewed from cracks in the road. The government brought out Centralia's residents in 1992 via eminent domain and condemned the area. 7 residents won the legal right to remain there, but everyone else left and nobody is allowed to move there. Centralia's zip code was discontinued in 2002, and when the remaining residents pass away, their homes will become government property. Authorities have given up on extinguishing the blaze, which experts estimate could burn for at least another 250 years. Number 2. Contaminated but legal drinking water. Tap water is supposed to be safe to drink, but a new study reveals that it doesn't always live up to that standard. A clean water advocacy organization called the Environmental Working Group recently released the disturbing results of an analysis of drinking water contaminants in the US. The findings identified 56 new contaminants that appeared since the last analysis just 2 years ago. Chemicals that are known to cause a host of health problems including cancer, reproductive issues, liver disease, and more are alarmingly present throughout the country. An estimated 100 million people are affected by the presence of these substances, which include a newly identified class of toxic industrial chemicals. The list includes pesticides, radioactive materials, and disinfectant byproducts, things people would never knowingly put into their bodies. But that's not the worst news. EWG senior scientist Tasha Stoiber told The Guardian that if regulations were as strict as she believes they should be, the list would be much longer. In other words, the potentially dangerous chemicals in American tap water are not limited to the ones identified in the study. Stoiber also pointed out that regulations are established too slowly and that laws aren't keeping up with the dangerous materials that end up in drinking water. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency only started testing for a chemical called HAA9 after studies connected it to a low birth rate. Until then, HAA9 was considered safe, and who knows how many people guzzled it down, unaware of the risks associated with it. It doesn't look like the legislative process to impose new regulations will speed up anytime soon. So the most people can do is educate themselves about what's in their local water supply and buy a filter to make it as safe as possible. In the meantime, it wouldn't hurt to nudge lawmakers in the right direction by advocating for heightened safety standards. Number 1. World War II Bomb. In 2020, a strange artifact appeared on a beach in England near the seaside town of Weston-super-Mare. A Royal Navy bomb disposal team reported to the site along the Bristol Channel after receiving reports of an unidentified object in the sand. The item in question turned out to be a World War II-era anti-submarine explosive. During the war, there was a weapons research facility nearby, which could perhaps explain how it ended up on the beach. The team carefully dug around the bomb and determined that it could be live. Fearing that it could explode unpredictably in the water conditions at the time, they waited until low tide and then safely detonated the device. World War II bombs have turned up in Europe and elsewhere plenty of times, so it's unlikely that this discovery will be the last of its kind. This also raises concerns about whether anyone will ever get hurt by handling one of these devices out of curiosity, not realizing it could be dangerous, or by accidentally going near one without realizing it's there. To avoid compromising civilian safety, experts are the only people who should go near an artifact that they don't recognize. Professionals encourage the public not to touch anything that looks suspicious or that they may not recognize.
Number 10. Japanese ghost ships. In Japan, a mysterious collection of ghost ships have risen from their watery graves. The ships are from a bloody assault on Iwo Jima during World War II. A volcanic eruption was behind the sudden surfacing of 24 Japanese transport vessels. These vessels were captured by the Navy in 1945, very close to the end of the war. The Americans abandoned the ships off the western coast of the island to create an artificial breakwater. But after the war, all the ships were allowed to just sink offshore and be forgotten. Nobody saw them again for nearly 100 years, until seismic activity beneath Mount Suribachi in 2021 caused the seabed to rise. There are at least 110 active volcanoes under the sea in this area. With all these volcanoes coming to life, pushing the ground up, the wrecks of all the ships were also pushed up. They rose all the way to the surface, showing off their broken hulls for the first time since the war. Number 9. Lost bodies. The bodies of over 30 Marines and sailors from World War II have been discovered on the Pacific atoll of Tarawa. In November of 1943, there was a battle that lasted 3 days. The battle was between the US and Japan, as the island was an extremely fortified Japanese command center. In fact, it was so well fortified that a Japanese commander was quoted as saying it would take 100 million men over 100 years to conquer it. But it didn't. It took 18,000 American soldiers and just 3 days. The bodies, now found on the island, likely belong to members of the 6th Marine Regiment. But it's been tough to excavate the bodies because the graves of the dead were found beneath the water table. In order to dig, the excavators have to continuously pump out water every day. According to experts on site, the graves were dug hastily as the men died and the American troops island hopped deeper and deeper into Japanese territory, taking one island at a time. They had no choice but to quickly bury the dead and move on to the next battle. Still, now that the bodies have been found, they will be brought home. The U.S. Defense Department is planning to transport all the dead bodies over 2,300 miles to Hawaii, where they can be identified. Number 8. Nazi Diaries. A historian has discovered never-before-seen diaries from World War II. These diaries detail things like the fall of Leningrad, the terrible famine that spread across Russia, and the terrifying truth of the citizens of Leningrad who resorted to cannibalism. If you are a war enthusiast, you know the Battle of Leningrad was the biggest and bloodiest in the entire war. The battle lasted from September of 1941 to January of 1944. It was approximately 872 days, with more than 800,000 fatalities. The diaries were uncovered by Professor Alexis Perry at Boston University. He was looking through the Russian archives when he came across these journals, which had been collected but not analyzed. Alexis went through them, even compiling the stories into a book. One of the tales in the diaries was from a young girl who wrote about her father getting so hungry that he killed and ate their dog. And he wasn't the only one. Historian Guy Walters says at least 1,500 people were arrested for practicing cannibalism after the siege of the city. People ate dead humans for nourishment, as well as even murdering and eating people like their friends and neighbors. Number 7. Dead nuns. The bare skeletons of 3 nuns have been discovered in Poland. They had been brutally killed by Russian soldiers near the end of World War II. The remains were uncovered by archaeologists working in the small town of Orneta. They had been looking for the remains of 7 Catholic nuns reportedly killed by the Soviets as they stormed through the country. Even though the Soviets technically liberated Poland from Nazi Germany, they didn't end up being much better than the Nazis. The Red Army seized control by murdering pretty much anyone they wanted. They killed local soldiers, they killed religious figures, and they burned and destroyed and looted churches. Records from 1945 show that the nuns from the Order of St. Catherine of Alexandria were killed by Soviet soldiers, some stabbed to death, some beaten to death, and one even locked in the attic and starved. Not only that, but the nuns may have also been abused and sexually tortured at the hands of the soldiers. Pretty sure that's a sure way to get a ticket to hell. 4 of the nuns' bodies were found during previous digs, and this final excavation uncovered the last 3: Sister Rolanda, Sister Gunhilda, and Sister Bona. Number 6. Hamburg Bomb. In the German city of Hamburg, a construction crew in a densely populated neighborhood found a bomb. The bomb was 1,000 pounds and was so dangerous that it could have exploded under the wrong circumstances and blew apart an entire city block. The authorities had to evacuate 6,000 people from the neighborhood while the bomb squad came in to carefully defuse the issue. But where did this giant bomb come from? It was most likely dropped by the US during World War II. Hamburg was the target of a serious bombing campaign, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, between July 25 and August 3, 1943. They absolutely decimated the city, but not all the bombs blew up. Some are still hiding just beneath the surface, like explosive clams that nobody knows are down there. The bomb squad took care of this one promptly and without any fatalities, but who knows what could happen next time. How would you feel about living in a city where there are literally bombs underneath the buildings that could go off at any minute? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. The Dachau concentration camp. The most horrifying discovery of World War II happened immediately at its end. When the world discovered the Dachau concentration camp, when it was liberated by US troops, it was the most horrifying discovery probably in human history. The men from the 42nd Rainbow Division, US soldiers, entered the Bavarian town of Dachau just as World War II was slowly winding to an end. What they expected to find was an abandoned training facility. What they discovered instead was one of the biggest concentration camps used by the Nazis. At this time, concentration camps were more of a myth than a reality. The US forces liberated those people still stuck in the camp, but what they found there was horrible. Corpses, train cars filled with rotten human bodies, and thousands of people who were so malnourished and weak that they were described as walking skeletons. Dachau had been the very first Nazi concentration camp, and the longest one in operation. Even throughout the whole war, the soldiers from the US had no idea about the atrocities that the Nazis were perpetrating. This is something we know now, but something not even those fighting the Nazis knew about until the discovery of Dachau. Number 4. Communist War Prison. A human body has been uncovered in an exercise yard at an old communist war prison in the Mokotów district of Warsaw. Specialists with the Institute of National Remembrance were carrying out archaeological work to find Polish victims of the Germans who once occupied the city. The human body that they excavated may belong to a wartime hero, a guy named Witold Pilecki. He was a Polish officer who volunteered of his own free will to go to the Auschwitz concentration camp. It was part of an undercover operation in which the Polish resistance fighter was to gather intelligence. In 1948, just years after the war had ended, Witold was on trial for charges of espionage. His trial was in March, and in May of that same year, the communist authorities shot him dead in prison. They killed him so that he couldn't cause any more fuss. The experts say this newest body found under the ruins of the prison could just belong to this legendary Polish hero. He was buried without a coffin in a shallow grave as one last act of disrespect by the Russians. Number 3. Douglas SBD Dauntless. 130 feet underwater in the Pacific Ocean, there are over 150 planes rotting in an ocean graveyard. These aircraft date back to World War II, all victims of the Pacific campaign between the Allies and the Japanese. In recent years, more and more amazing aircraft have been photographed and documented at the bottom of the ocean. There are American aircrafts like the TBF Avenger, the F-4U Corsair, and the Douglas SBD Dauntless. But what's really interesting about these planes is that they weren't the victims of fighting. Instead, they were dumped into the ocean after the war because it became too expensive to bring them back to the US. Just off the coast of the Kwajalein Atoll, the US military let their airplanes slide into the water like pouring the rest of your cold coffee down the drain. Number 2. Sunken Aircraft Carrier. Speaking of sunken treasure, a legendary aircraft carrier from the war has been discovered intact on the floor of the ocean. images taken of the destroyed vessel are spooky, yet fascinating. It's sitting at the bottom of the ocean, 17,500 feet deep near the Solomon Islands. And because it's so deep, it's barely even rusted in the last 75 years. This is the USS Hornet, which sank in 1942. The carrier's most famous role during the war was the Doolittle Raid in April of 1942. It was used for a surprise bombing campaign against Tokyo. 16 B-25 bombers took off from the deck of the ship and rained down fire on the Japanese capital. It didn't win the war, but it showed the Japanese that Pearl Harbor was a serious mistake. Just a few months after the Tokyo raid, the USS Hornet met its match in the Battle of Santa Cruz Island. Japanese planes dropped enough bombs onto the aircraft carrier that the crew was forced to abandon ship. The US wanted to scuttle the boat, but failed, and the carrier finally ended up underwater when it was hit by 4 torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. In total, 111 sailors died. Number 1. Identifying the remains. Near the French village of Kitsult, on December 31, 1944, Jack Cummings went missing. He was 22 years old, from Juneau, Wisconsin. He was last seen in a foxhole where he left behind a piece of his skull and his helmet that had a bullet hole through it. Nobody knew where his body went, but he was assumably killed in action. For the next 74 years, nobody truly knew what happened to Jack. He existed only in military files and dental charts. But here's the thing. In 1946, the year after the war was over, a single grave of an American GI was found just across the border of France in the German town of Ifesheim. The individual was killed during an enemy raiding party in the village of Kitsult. His body was dragged across the Rhine and buried. But for 74 years, nobody had been able to identify the man in the grave. It wasn't until 2018 that DNA was taken from the corpse and linked to Jack Cummings. Even though his parents are dead and most of his relatives are dead, and the ones still alive didn't really know him very well, it was still amazing for his one surviving nephew to finally get closure. After all this time, he finally learned what happened to his Uncle Jack. Number 10. Stack Rock Fort. Stack Rock Fort is located in Milford Haven, the country of Wales. It was built as an island fortress in the 19th century to protect the region from any possible sea invasion. It's 800 yards from the coast, built over the span of 2 years between 1850 and 1852. At the time, it was under private ownership, but since there were no attacks happening on Wales, the fortress seemed like a pretty silly thing to keep pumping money into for maintenance. By 1895, all its artillery was outdated and useless. It was basically just abandoned after this, though there was a small skeleton crew of soldiers during World War I manning the fort, just in case. In 1932, Stack Rock Fort was put up for sale and sold for around $60. Yes, you got an entire island fortress for under $100 back in the 1930s. Talk about prime real estate. All these years later, when it went up for sale again in 2015, the asking price was $150,000. When it finally sold 5 years later, in 2020, the price had gone up by over 25%. And while the fortress is still abandoned, it has a new owner now, and they plan on turning it into a museum. Number 9. Kitsult. The Canadian town of Kitsult is unlike most mysterious ghost towns you might come across while driving through the western US. It's not full of ruins. There are no ghosts that we know about, and it doesn't look as though the place has been deserted for decades. In fact, the most outrageous thing about the abandoned town of Kitsult on the coast of British Columbia is that the lights are still on. The houses here are still in immaculate condition. There are banks and pubs and cinemas, even shopping centers and restaurants. Every single building is abandoned and empty, yet spotless and in pristine condition. It looks as though everyone got up and left in the middle of the night, or was abducted by aliens. The truth is that the town has been abandoned since 1982. That was only 3 years after it came to life. The town began in 1979 as a community for workers at the local mine. But the market crashed, and all 1,200 residents abandoned the town, and that was the end of the story. Then, in 2005, an American entrepreneur bought the entire town for $7 million. and since then, he's put $25 million of upgrades into the town. Even though it's abandoned, it's owned by a rich guy and in better shape than most towns across North America. He has over a dozen caretakers that regularly go around mowing lawns, trimming trees, sweeping streets, dusting things off, and making repairs, just to keep everything looking great. But what's he going to do with the whole town, we wonder? Do you have any ideas? Number 8. The Murder Neighborhood. Urban explorer Dax Ward discovered an entire community abandoned on the outskirts of Bangkok, Thailand. The rundown houses are plagued by overgrown grass and the walls riddled with graffiti. The neighborhood was once the scene of a brutal murder 20 years ago, in which a female student was tortured and killed. The community itself goes back to the 1990s. The neighborhood was under development when the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997. Many of the houses were left unfinished, and the entire neighborhood slowly began to get swallowed back by the jungle. A few years later, in the early 2000s, a female university student was kidnapped, brought into one of the abandoned houses, and slain. According to what Dax Ward was able to gather from the locals when he visited the community to take pictures, she was beaten so badly her face was unrecognizable. The murderer was never caught, and now those who visit the abandoned neighborhood say they see a young woman's ghost floating between the houses. Number 7. Bunker in the Woods. In Michigan, a man stumbled upon the creepiest and most mysterious abandoned place that we're talking about today. The place is really more of a thing, a bunker discovered in the middle of the forest. The man who found the bunker is Matthew Adams, a local resident who likes to explore the wooded trails around Greenville. He was quite a bit off the normal path when he came across what could be a crematorium, a military bunker, or even some kind of tomb. The entrance had been sealed off with bricks so that nobody can get inside unless they bust the thing down. Matthew did not break into the mysterious structure. Instead, he took photos of it and posted them online to see if he could get any information. Other locals from Michigan suggested that it could have something to do with old industry, perhaps from a manufacturing plant. The entrance may have been sealed because of contamination issues. However, nobody actually knows what the mysterious bunker in the woods is. What do you think Matthew found out there in the forest? Is it a forgotten tomb or just a boring leftover from a manufacturing facility? Let us know your suspicions in the comments below, and if you are liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Tranquil Sanatorium. The Tranquil Sanatorium was in use for over 80 years, first as a tuberculosis hospital and then as a psychiatric institution. In 1867, tuberculosis was the #1 death of Canadians, so the sanatorium was pretty much a necessity. The hospital opened on November 28, 1907. It went under the name the King Edward Memorial Sanatorium. But as more and more people kept getting sick, the hospital needed to get larger. It could only accommodate 49 patients, 4 nurses, and 12 attendants. Eventually, the sanatorium grew so big that it had 360 beds. The hospital changed in the 1940s when tuberculosis could finally be fought with drugs. By 1958, the sanatorium was changed to a mental hospital. This lasted for about 30 years, until in July of 1983 when it was announced that the sanatorium would close. The issue at the time was that there were still 324 patients being treated at the center and 650 staff members living on site. Everyone had to be relocated to the small city of Glendale. Once the sanatorium was closed, it was abandoned. The land was sold in 1991 to an Italian developer. He wanted to turn the place into a tourist destination, but this fell through, and nobody has done anything with the Tranquil Sanatorium since then. It's still sitting in the same shape it was when it closed, only now it's allegedly haunted and filled with the ghosts of tuberculosis victims and the mentally insane. Number 5. Cave of Mystery. The Tom Nadishin mine is an abandoned mining shaft in Perth and Kinross, Scotland. From the outside, it looks like the entrance to a mysterious cave where you might find some kind of mythical creature. For those with a keen eye, you might recognize the great mouth of the cave from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This was the actual location where they filmed King Arthur and his brave knights confronting the killer rabbit. But in real life, the cave mine was built in the 19th century as an attempt by locals to pillage copper, gold and sulfur. But what the locals didn't realize at the time was that there actually was no copper or gold or sulfur. After the miners dug as deep as they could into the earth without finding anything, they were forced to give up and abandon the cave. It was the shortest-lived gold rush in history. Today, the abandoned cave is in such an elusive spot that when the guys from Monty Python went back to find the cave for their 25th anniversary special, they couldn't even remember where it was. Number 4. Spanish Ghost Town. The ruins of Belchite are haunting, creepy, and a grim reminder of the horrors of war. Back in 1936, this town was on the front lines of the Spanish Civil War. A revolt of fascist nationalists caused an outbreak of war when they tried to take over the government. When this happened, Spain rebelled and local armies began to fight back. This went on for 3 years until the fascist nationalists finally won in 1939. The city of Belchite was at the forefront of the fighting. By the time the war was over, the town was a complete ruin. People couldn't even tell where the streets had been. Carcasses had to be pulled from underneath broken beams and piles of mortar. There were dead mules everywhere. It was nasty. Today, Belchite is one of the most unnerving ghost towns anywhere in Europe. It looks exactly like it did almost a century ago in 1939. There are still piles of rubble covering the streets, and the buildings are still all destroyed. There may even be some donkey bones to find if you look hard enough. Number 3. Bannerman Castle. On a small island in New York, there is a mysterious abandoned castle that is very gradually disappearing. It's the Bannerman Castle, and it's currently situated on Polapel Island in the Hudson River. At one point, this was a fortress of weapons, only accessible via private boat. It was Francis Bannerman who built the thing in the earliest part of the 20th century. He had been a famous Scottish arms dealer who needed a place to store all his weaponry. Specifically, the castle was used to store massive amounts of black powder. What better place than an island fortress in the middle of the Hudson, right? Francis Bannerman died in 1918. His castle fell into disrepair, and his family business went on until the 1970s, running out of a warehouse on Long Island. The New York State took ownership of the castle in 1967, but by then it was pretty run down. They had wanted to turn the island into a park, but in 1969, a random fire burned down what little remained of the castle. Ever since then, the island has been off limits to the public. Number 2. The Scarista Bus. The Scarista Bus can be found on Scotland's Isle of Harris. It's a mysterious, wrecked vehicle with an unusual tale behind why it was abandoned. The story goes back to 2005, when a great storm approached the coastline. Hurricane-force winds destroyed a caravan that was being used by local scouts for their weekend adventures. A year after that, a new bus was donated to the scouts to replace the obliterated old caravan. It became a clubhouse for the kids. The driver's cabin was even turned into a bathroom. It was a perfect base for explorations on the remote island. But somewhere between 2006 and today, the bus lost its magic. There are no more songs or hymns being sung by the children. Instead, it's bleak and depressing and has not been maintained. There are no restoration projects on the horizon. Nobody's used the bus for years, and the local people can't even figure out what happened for it to have been abandoned in such a hurry. Do you have any ideas? Number 1. Island of Dolls. The Island of Dolls is undoubtedly the creepiest place in all of Mexico. In Spanish, it's called Isla de las Muñecas. And for pretty much everyone, this place is a literal nightmare come to life. You've probably seen photographs of the creepy island inhabited by nothing but dolls. But you may not know the even more disturbing story behind how the island was created. The island was last owned by a guy named Julian Santana Barrera before his death in 2001. 50 years before that, Barrera saw a young girl and her sisters swimming in the river when the current carried one of them away. He tried to save her, but she drowned. Barrera then blamed himself for failing to save the girl's life. He was overcome with grief. He found her toy doll floating nearby and hung it in a tree. It was meant to be a sign of respect for the deceased child. At least that's one version of the story. Another version says the doll was meant to protect Barrera from the dead girl's spirit, or even to protect the girl's spirit from angry demons. Whatever started the tradition of the dolls in the trees, it carried on all throughout Barrera's life until he died. Within half a century, he had covered the deserted island in hundreds and hundreds of creepy dolls. What's the most mysterious abandoned place you've ever explored? Let us know about it in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, remember to subscribe for more amazing videos from the channel. See you next time. Bye!